Hello, welcome to Razaki 3D. On today's video, you will discover quick, easy techniques for making detailed 3D models with Subdivformer on your Android device. I have been using Subdivformer for the last 3 months or more, and I have discovered various techniques that I think I should be sharing with you right now, especially because you have witnessed me modeling various items on the channel, starting from a 3D model of a bullet, and I've also modeled a car, and the previous video I modeled a bus. I have been working on the automatic Kalashnikov rifle, which I've not finished for a long time now, and I just shelved it a little bit in order to learn a few techniques that I think I should be sharing with you. So today I will start with the first and foremost technique that every artist uses, whether it's in writing or any other form of art, including 3D modeling and animation, whichever platform you're using. So here is the first: thought process, or ideation. The process of ideation, first of all, begins with you having an imagination of what you're going to create, and in that process you have to observe whatever model you want to create. So if you're modeling a basic model, which I will be talking about right now, is what you're supposed to do is to make observations of how various components of that object really look. And because we're talking about detailed objects, I'm referring to objects which have different pieces, complex shapes, minute details, and also other additions that might be on a very complex model with comparison to a simple object like a sphere or a cube, which is basically an object with one surface. And so there are a few techniques that you would use in modeling various objects, but first you must go through the process of ideation and observation. Next, you've got to go to interpretation of how that model is supposed to look, because you're using an application like SDF 3D, and it has various functions, which I'll be talking about in another video, that you can use to manipulate your objects. So first of all, you have to interpret how that object that you want to model in Subdivformer should look while you're modeling it. You're imagining all this, you've not yet opened your application. Next, you have to translate. Now, in the process of translation is where you translate your interpretation of how that model looks in real life and how it should look in Subdivformer. Basically, what you're doing is saying what you're saying between translating it between your the visual appearance of that object in the real world, into the 3D application, and you will have to be modeling it while you're translating it. So I call it the translation step. And you have to research and observe. You have to look at basic, default, non-stylized variations of the object. For instance, if you're looking at an object like a bus, and for that matter, in the previous video I modeled a Kenyan bus, so it might not be familiar to very many of you who have not seen the Kenyan bus, but if you Google it, if you type it on your search engine, the Kenyan bus or matatu, M-A-T-A-T-U, you will see that all of them have unique shapes, and they have modifications that are not on the default shape of the bus. And so in order to model that bus, I had to look at the default non-stylized variation of the object. Within this project of modeling the Kenyan matatu or the bus, I had to make observations, and every time I got on the bus I counted the number of chairs that are there, and every time I crossed the road I also counted how many windows are there on the right hand side and the left hand side, and how the different aspects or sections of the bus interact with each other to make that body of the bus, and other sections of it like the tires and the rims. So the process never stops until you're done with the project. Next is general shapes. General shapes are really important for you to understand, and There are various shapes that we learn about in our elementary level. In elementary mathematics, we learn about triangles, squares. We learn about cubes, corns, spheres, and some of these are things that you can find on 3D modeling software on your computer. For instance, Blender. You can find a corn on Blender, you'd find a torus, you'd find a cube, which is the default object that you will always find when you start your Blender application. And I'm talking about Blender 2.79, and even Blender 2.8 has got that same cube at the middle of the viewport. And when you open your SDF 3D application, you will come across a very, very simple sphere. I like to call it the subdivided sphere because it has only 4 vertices. That aside, so with general shapes, you have to imagine, this is back to the translation process that I talked about earlier. You have to imagine what the general shape of the object you're going to model is. Now for a bus, if you're modeling a simple bus, the general shape of a bus is a cuboid. But if you're modeling a bus which you want to have it detailed, then you will have to realize that it's not just a square. It has various shapes that you have to consider there. So general shapes are just the shapes that you will use, or the meshes that you would use to originate the object that you want to work on. So while modeling the bus, I started off with the basic shape we always find on Subdivformer when you start it, which is the sphere, and dragged some sides. I mean, moved the sides, extruded some, intruded some, subdivided others, and until I got the shape of the bus. The reason why general shapes are really helpful is because it helps in the translation process, and in the translation process is where you imagine what detail will go to which section of your model and how the mesh is supposed to look. And you're gonna have to work with various meshes in order to come up with a very good, detailed, decent model of the object that you're making in your 3D software. That takes us to step number 3, or technique number 3, which is object elements and multiple projects. I'm going to start off with the first part of this technique, which is object elements, and we will draw some information from general shapes and translation and expand on them much further as we talk about the object elements. Now, I said that if you're modeling a bus which is not detailed, you would work with only one mesh or one object, and you will just imagine it to be a cuboid. But when you're working on a bus and you want it to be detailed, you'll have to focus on different areas of that bus or that object that you're making in order to come up with a very detailed object. Now in Subdivformer, it comes in really handy to consider using as many different separate objects as you would and merge them much later, because that assists you to come up with the object and have it detailed as possible and have the smallest details in it, because you cannot extrude everything and you cannot intrude everything and expect the bus to be neat or your model to be neat. Your mesh will just look really weird, like this car that I modeled earlier, and you can just see the car down there, upper right hand side corner of your screen right now, of the car that I modeled earlier. And so you have to consider object elements which are totally separated meshes from each other and merge them later. So what I mean by this is you'll have to get a few spheres and arrange them in certain positions that you imagine are forming the shape of that entire object you want to create. Or even if it's not your sphere, it could be a section of the object that you've created earlier, and you just want to combine them by merging them using the bridge function on Subdivformer to make sure that they they take you a step closer towards achieving your detailed model. Now let's talk about multiple projects. It's a very important section of this technique, which is very, very important. And multiple projects have got a very, very big assistance for you, because when you're using multiple projects, which is something I'll talk about later, so I'm just gonna save this, if you will allow me, for the next step, which is going to be step number 5 after we talk about step number 4, which is merging shapes and the 3D modeling long game. So merging shapes is what I was talking about earlier when I talked about object elements, and you've got to combine them to make your general shape, to achieve the shape of your detailed model. And so merging them is just basically placing them where they're supposed to be in relation to each other, and look for the attach or bridge the space between two facing faces. It's interesting how it just turns into two facing faces, but I hope you get the point. So each face, when you place an object closer to another one, or adjacent to another one, or alongside another one, or just basically next to another one, you will find out that there are these faces that look at each other. And in order to merge your faces, you have to make sure that you bridge them correctly. Both of them should be inclined towards the same angle, at least, to make sure that they do not have a wonky attachment towards each other. They should be straightforward towards each other. It should not wriggle around. So, and with that, you have got to think about the 3D modeling long game. I like to mention this so very, very much with a lot of emphasis, because it helps a whole lot when you're modeling something on Subdivformer and you understand you've got to merge or bridge gaps between various object elements that we talked about earlier. And because you've got to remember, sometimes you will use functions like subdivide or split functions, which will multiply the number of faces that are facing faces on another object. And so you have to play the 3D long game. You have to understand how many faces you're going to need on one particular element, with regards to how many faces you will need on another object element, and how they will combine when you're merging shapes. So you have to play the 3D long game, and also remember, maybe you will need to have a bolt modeled in between those two elements. After you merge them, they're going to be one, and this section that's it's joining them, you will have to model a bolt between them. And so you have to consider how's the general outlook of the model, how it will look when you get to a certain step. So let's talk about multiple projects, which was the second part of the third technique I mentioned earlier. So this is technique number 5, and I call it multiple projects as backups. And we're gonna combine this with step number 6, which is avoiding crashes. But before we go on to the next step, or the next technique, which is technique number 6, let's talk about technique number 5, which is multiple projects as backups. So why backups? Okay, and how do they work? So the first reason you should have backups in Subdivformer is because when you model your mesh and have multiple objects in one project, you have higher chances of experiencing a crash, and when your object crash, when your project crashes, you will lose your model. It's highly likely when the file gets corrupted. It once happened to me, and you would realize that when I was modeling the bus on the video I uploaded earlier, part 1 of how to model a bus with Subdivformer on Android, that bus is not the same bus that I completed on the third video, or the part 3 of how to model a bus with Subdivformer, you can have a look at the 2 videos on the upper right corner of your screen right now. So I lost the model because the entire project was heavy, multiple objects all over, and the number of vertices were really increasing. Unfortunately, Subdivformer cannot tell you how many vertices you have, and although Blender can, and I think other 3D animation, 3D modeling and animation software on your computer have this feature where they tell you how many faces, how many vertices, and how many edges you've got. I'm much more familiar with Blender, so I lost the entire project. I could only see the thumbnail, and when I clicked on the file, all that will show up will be the elementary cube or subdivided sphere that you always find when you're starting Subdivformer. It was really nasty. So I discovered that you can use multiple projects as backups. As backups, and if you want to do that, the best way to do that is to go back to your gallery on your Subdivformer application on your Android device, and long press on your project and tap on this little button up here to multiply it, or to duplicate it. Actually, it's to duplicate it, and then click on one of the projects and advance and model much further and add details on it, and then save it. And when you've saved it, you're secure. You're safe to delete the object that is a few processes behind the updated object or the project that is updated. So that's the reason number 1 you're supposed to have backups, because what happens when your SDF 3D application crashes, it's highly likely you're going to lose the project. Now, in this point, I'm also going to tell you how backups work, because they work really fantastically. So when you have let's talk a little bit about multiple projects and what I mean by multiple projects. So you can use multiple projects to work on one single model on SDF 3D, and it is something that I highly recommend. You might want to model all your elements or of one object in one project, but I highly recommend that you model different sections or objects of your final model in multiple projects to save the progress, and also to make sure that your mesh is much lighter. That will help you to avoid crashes. And so you have to have multiple projects. And so when I was modeling the bus, I'm going to relate to this, and as you can see, the chair that I'm modeling right now on the screen, I have multiple projects of the same project, but all of them comprise a different unique section of the model than the other one, and that's very important. So when I was modeling the bus, I had to have the tires and the rims separated from the drivetrain and the bus's floor, and I had the body also modeled on another project which I was working on much later, and I also duplicated it to make sure that whatever progress I made, in case it crashes, I would still come back to a certain point where I could work on it. So 2 ways that you need backups, 2 ways that backups help really much, is that they save the progress in case of your application crashing and your file getting corrupted. You'll have to just go to the duplicate project or the duplicate file and start working on it to recover the progress you made. And if you do not have a crash and you have these 2 projects which are duplicated, and you realize that you made a mistake while updating the one of those 2 items, all you can do is just to go back to the projects that you had earlier and start advancing it once again. Now you might wonder why I'm saying that you should have such and go back to another project to update it to a certain level when you feel like you don't like your updated model. The reason yet Subdivformer has the undo function, which works really well. The reason I'm saying this is because if you have a huge object, and which is really heavy and is demanding on your resources, you're gonna want to have to save another project, because if you undo it, you'd realize that your phone slows down. It starts freezing much more, and it slows down your progress, and it starts getting to you, and you might start feeling anxious depending on how patient you can be. And so that's why I'm suggesting that you just go back to the other project and model from where you left to where you had gotten to, and advance toward that place, and have a much better model than the previous one that disappointed you earlier. And another benefit is that when you go back to a certain step, you will remember the mistakes that you made in the progress that you made previously, and you can also correct them much faster when you've got this extra project that is similar to that. With that, let's move to technique number 6, which is avoid crashes. The 4-5 vertices polygon. okay, let me try to simplify this. I'm just reading my notes and it's looking really funny and really mouthy. So process or technique number 6 is avoid crashes. I've mentioned earlier that you can use multiple projects to avoid crashes, and I've said you can have different sections of your model in different projects. And by the way, you can actually copy and paste them from one project to another, and the more you do that, of course, the updated model, which has got copies of the models that you've got on the other projects, will become heavier. But when you're copying and pasting, it's far much better than modifying a heavy 3D object in one viewport. So that's a very important thing to remember, and that's how to use multiple projects to achieve a very highly detailed model that will be really impressive to the eye. And by the way, I'm just wanted to show you this image that is of the Kenyan bus, how it looked when I imported the STL format of the model into Blender 2.79. Just took screenshots of how it looks, and I think it really helps to see how detailed that model really is, although I really have to do a few things like retopologizing, and in future, in another video, I'm going to talk about cross-platform modeling, and you will see what exactly I mean by retopologizing a model that I've imported from Subdivformer to Blender. I'll also talk about modifiers that are in Blender that actually Subdivformer has, but you'll see the differences when we talk about when I get to another video in future, where I will be comparing the differences between modeling on Android devices or on a computer, what the difference is between the two devices and the two platforms. So I said avoid crashes is step or technique number 6, and so the number of vertices that you've got on your model are very important, and they determine whether or not your modeling software on your computer or on your mobile phone will crash or not, and how fast you can work on your project. So what I realized when I imported my first model from Subdivformer into Blender is that I found that there is a difference with the way the vertices are arranged between these two platforms, these two applications. When you're modeling on Subdivformer, you'd really see that your mesh is light, and it has 4-sided polygons which comprise 4 vertices basically. But because Subdivformer has already subdivided your model in order to make it smoother, I think that's because it's an application for the Android small RAM compared to the computer RAM and processor. I think it's very important that they subdivided it for us in order to have those really nice looking curves. And because it's got this subdivision already applied upon it, when you import your model into Blender, you'd realize that a polygon with 4 sides, 4 vertices on Subdivformer actually has actually has 5 vertices in the middle of them. Or you would also realize that instead of 5 vertices, it has a hypotenuse in the middle. So you can see the difference between the cup that you can see on your screen right now on Subdivformer and how it is exhibited in Blender. And I also realized that when I modeled the bus, it really was heavy on Subdivformer and it was still very heavy on Blender. And the reason is because I actually realized that without even noticing it, but I felt it. Of course I actually felt it because the model started slowing down my quad-core processor on my Oppo A3s. So when I brought it to Blender, I found out that it had 199,478 vertices, and it was that's basically very, very heavy. So I call it the 4-5 vertices paradox polygon between Subdivformer and Blender. Quite a mouthful. Okay, so let's move to technique number 7, which is proportion, copying and pasting steps, and the mirror function. So some of these things I've mentioned earlier, for instance copying and pasting, when I talked about multiple projects comprising various parts of your final model. I'm still going to talk about it a little bit, but I want to start with proportion. Now Subdivformer has got the mirror function, which works like the Blender mirror function, but it's a little bit different. You can only mirror across the y-axis on Subdivformer, but in Blender you can choose which axis you want to mirror between. You want to mirror across. For instance, if you want to mirror across the x-axis, you'll have to select the x-axis or the y-axis or the z-axis with regards to your preference and how the model is going to be. But I do not like using the mirror function on Subdivformer. Instead, I like to do something I call double modeling. So double modeling is copying and pasting one object onto the other side and modeling them, both of them simultaneously. So what I mean by this is, let's take an example of when I was modeling the headlamps of the bus. So I added a sphere into the viewport and then modified it a little bit before I copied it and pasted it, then moved it all the way to the other side, where I started the process of what I call double modeling. So I will select a few faces on one section or on one sphere and select similar faces but facing the opposite direction on the other sphere and resize them by making them smaller across the y-axis. And I will also employ other functions, for instance subdividing and all the functions that can work with regards to the mirror function and faces on Subdivformer. So let's talk a little bit about, so that really helps with proportion. But then there is also another way to maintain proportion if you're not going to copy and paste. So one of them is steps. This is another section of the technique where you maintain your proportion. So you have to consider steps, and steps only, I think I've only seen them in Subdivformer. I've not seen them in another software or application. Although in Blender you can actually resize or move across steps by selecting whatever element you want to select, for instance a face or a vertex or an edge, and you will have to hold down the control button, and when you move it, it will actually you hold down your control button, of course with your mouse button held. So let's start the process. You will have to select an element, which will be a face or a sphere. No, not a sphere, it could be a face or a vertex or an edge, and you will you'll press the G button, that's for grab, when you press the G button, and then you select whichever axis you'd like to move it across, and you'd have to hold down the control button, and with each step you move your mouse, you'd realize that it'll be moving in a sticky way. It'll actually count the steps for you. Now, the steps that are on Subdivformer work differently. You'd have to select between moving you'd have to type in the number of steps you want to move your element. It could be the entire object, it could be a section of the object, which is a face or an edge or a vertex. You decide to move it whichever number of steps. You can also rotate it to a certain number of steps. You can also scale it to a certain number of steps. And so with proportion is actually aided by remembering, setting a specific number of steps you'd like to manipulate your object with, and actually remembering how many times you tap the move button on your Android device, and implement the same but in an opposite direction or in an opposite manner in order to have the same effect in the mirror direction of what you were actually working on previously. Now, mirror function was going to be the third thing I would have talked about, but I already mentioned it. So I think we're going to wrap up this video right here, where I talked a little bit about the techniques that are quite easy for making detailed 3D models on your Android platform or your Android device using the Subdivformer application. So thank you very much for watching this far, and watch out for the next videos, which I'll be talking about other interesting things. For instance, using the lessons that I learned to finish the AK-47 rifle model that I was working on earlier. So do not forget to subscribe if you're new to this channel, and come back another day in order to find out what the progress would have been.